All right. This section is going to talk about Darwin and his connection to the theory of evolution. So, Darwin, right? I talked about this before. He went to the Galapagos Islands, made this epic journey across the world with um, some random buddies that he met at a monastery. He's super interesting, Darwin. And I spend more time on him usually, but we just don't have that luxury. Anyway, he made this epic journey and then eventually found all these really cool links between organisms that he saw at different geographical locations across the world and found these connections, made sketches, and look at his notes over here on the left side. This is sweet. And it says, I think, and talks about how these different organisms branch off from one another, but have these linkages to one another. So he never called it evolution. Darwin never called it evolution, but he called it descent with modification, which is so adorable. Anyway, he's saying that these organisms descended from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. That's from his notes. So that relates to, again, these are called cladograms or phylogenetic trees, which we'll get into later, but these show how we have some similarities in traits. And again, we know that we have the access to molecular homologies now, like DNA, amino acid sequences, that sort of thing, and being able to really show how related they are through genetics, which is cool. Anyway, Darwin's theory of natural selection and descent with modification stems from this idea of adaptations or sequences or characteristics of an organism that are going to allow them to survive and thrive within their environment and reproduce at a greater rate than organisms within their species with other sequences or traits. So these adaptations are going to allow them to be more successful. And a lot of these adaptations are going to be related to camouflage, right? Google search the what do I want to say? The mimic octopus. That's it. The mimic octopus. Look at that thing. That thing is sweet. Anyway, it has to do with camouflage and being able to avoid predators or just keep yourself safe and kind of just able to survive and thrive. So the thrive piece is the reproduction part, being able to pass their genes on, right? So if you can evade predators, you can survive longer than your, neighbors, and you can reproduce and pass your genes along. That's the whole purpose of organisms. That's what some scientists argue, is to survive, thrive, and then reproduce. So that's the reproductive piece. There are some adaptations that might make you look more attractive, right? We have the ability to change our hairstyles and Botox, whatever. Those are not adaptations, but we could kind of think of them that way. But organisms also have that same ability where they have different sexual adaptations that make them more attractive to their mates, right? So we're thinking like peacocks and their plumage being so brightly colored. And if you don't have the bright colors, I'm not even going to bother and take time to get to know you. Moving on. When we talk about natural selection, we also want to talk about artificial selection. So natural selection is when nature is deciding and putting some pressures towards that specific species to change and modify to better fit the environment that it lives in so that it can survive and thrive and reproduce, right? This natural selection piece is saying that it can work on the individual level. That'll eventually get passed along throughout that individual level to the entire population. And if it sticks and fits for that species, then that leads to the evolution part. So examples, beaks. Okay, so we got bird beaks, right? We got some that are short and stubby, rounded tips, really pointed tips. We have long little like spout-like beaks. There are all sorts of different beaks out there. But depending on where you live, if you are in an area that's especially woody, like lots of trees, and you have to like peck to get your insects and your food, right? A rounded tip beak is not going to be successful for you. And even in that matter, if it's short and pointy, your beak might break trying to break through those bark pieces. You want something that's strong and sturdy and can dig into create holes and get your grub or whatever it is. Okay. So that would be natural selection. Artificial selection is when humans get involved and start messing around with things, right? So this is also called selective breeding, where we're looking at specific traits that we want in order to enhance that organism, or just for fun, which we see a lot of. Oftentimes, this is related to some inbreeding that occurs. So think like racehorses is a really good example of inbreeding, where you get that genetic line of really, really good racehorses. And so they just kind of breed them with the best ones. And then the genetic sequences are going to be looking a lot similar to one another. Inbreeding for other animals and plants and things like that is less detrimental, but you can still see some issues that are related to that. Inbreeding, that makes me think of, the royal family back in the day. Thought that it was related to bloodlines. So there was a lot of incest that went on there, and there were some issues with that. But going back to animals, artificial selection or selective breeding would be like all of those different dog versions we have out there. My neighbors just got super cute dog, Winnie. She is, a golden doodle. So we have all these mashups, or like a little teacup Yorkie that fits in your little pocket. We have all these different options that we can do with dogs and create, different species to our liking. There are some trade-offs to that, though. Anyway, that's natural selection versus artificial selection. So as we know, once humans get involved, we can start kind of affecting things and impacting their survival rates over time. Sorry, needed that. Anyway, there are some key components to natural selection, to Darwin's theory of natural selection. It has to deal with, there has to be competition between populations, between individuals within the same environment, right? Only the strongest will survive, which is not really true. Some, traits don't necessarily lead you to be the strongest. They're just going to be best suited for your environment, right? But they're going to be competing for those limited resources, whether it's food, whether it's the habitat, whether it's the mates, that sort of thing. They're going to be competing, and whichever, individual, whichever population survives and thrives and makes it through the competition piece are going to have the traits that are best suited for their environment. So that's natural selection. We call it evolutionary fitness, where those favorable adaptations get passed along into future generations. And so those adaptations can be passed along. There's some good videos if you're a video person to look into. And then my last piece is going to be, these are called modes of natural selection, which basically represent how different factors in the environment, whether, again, it's habitat, competition, predators, sexual resources, mates, that sort of thing, whatever is present within that environment might cause a shift in the gene pool for a species and cause a population to evolve, or we can see natural selection occurring where some specific traits are going to be more favorable than others. So there's three types I'll talk about this first one, which is called directional selection. So anytime we're looking at this, you're going to see this one you're going to see this graph with a dashed line, and this dashed line is going to represent the general population in the beginning. So the control group, how a population is going to have their alleles or their gene frequencies across the bottom. And the extreme alleles, like the extreme traits, are most commonly going to be found with low populations. And then the middle group is likely going to be associated to a larger population that holds the combination of these traits. So, test scores are always, related to the standard bell curve. So we're looking at a population that starts off with this dashed line shape where the extreme ends are low in population and the middle group is typically associated to the larger population. Anyway, directional selection is going to move the spike or our curve, the peak of our bell curve, to one direction or the other based off of whatever specific traits that is. Sorry. Let's see. When I talk about this one, I like to associate directional selection to giraffes and their necks. Okay? So in the original giraffe population, we have giraffes with short necks on the far side, or maybe over here, I should be pointing down below, short necks. We've got medium neck length giraffes, and then we have really long neck length giraffes. And at first, the larger population were medium sized because that meant they could reach the trees for food. They could also eat on the ground and not have an issue there. But then we have this competition between short necks, medium necks, long necks. I'm thinking of all the other species out there that are feeding on the plant species that these giraffes are trying to feed on. So there was heavy competition for the ground. So having a short neck length was no longer favorable for giraffes. So eventually that population amount kept decreasing for those short neck length giraffes. It's really hard to say. Medium length also didn't really serve good use for giraffes. They could reach the trees, they could also reach the ground, but that meant they were competing with all sorts of different species and populations up in the trees and towards the ground. So they weren't able to survive and thrive. The ones with the really, really long necks on the extreme side of things were able to reach the tip tops of the trees where there were minimal competitors for those same resources. So directional selection would be moving towards the long neck length giraffes are more favorable than any other. Disruptive selection. When you disrupt something, you're interrupting or you're breaking apart the flow of things. So that is what's happening with disruptive selection. Normally our population is like this. During disruptive, it's breaking and disrupting the flow of the genes. And it's actually going to favor kind of get rid of that average and shift things towards more of the extremes. So I actually was just talking about this with my husband. Nerd alert. And he was looking outside the window with my son, and he was like, "Whoa, did you see that squirrel jump from that teeny branch to the other teeny branch?" And I was like, "That is called disruptive selection." And it has to deal with the fact that, some squirrel populations, this is so dumb, some squirrel populations are better suited for climbing on the tree branches, while others are more towards, groundies is what I called them. And he laughed at me and he was like, "Okay, you weirdo." But anyway, our population for squirrel tail length impacts their survival. If they have a short tail, they can be really fast on the ground and not worry about their tail getting in the way of predators. If they have a medium length tail, they can climb on trees, but they can't get to the, very thin branches, and they can't climb all the way to the top because the tail is not quite long enough to counterbalance their ability to jump and get up higher. So they have, limited height that they can reach to evade predators. And then really long tails have the ability to climb up those trees and hide way up high and avoid their predators and jump from branch to branch with no issue or less of an issue. So those medium length tails eventually get decreased in population size. Well, the short ones that are really, really fast on the ground and the long tails that are high up in the trees can survive and thrive and pass that genetic information along to their offspring. So that's disruptive selection. Our last one is stabilizing selection, which is going to favor that intermediate or favor the mean. And when we're talking about stabilizing selection, it's going to select against the extremes, right? So again, the bell curve is going to spike towards the average. Birth weight for babies, great example of stabilizing selection, right? In order to survive birth, there's an average weight that is typically associated to higher rates of survival for both the baby and the mother. Right, somewhere around like 8 pounds, right? 7-8 pounds. Some of you are like, that's humongous. Well, it could be all the way down, to like 4 or 5 pounds, but we're talking about preemies that you might have they do have a lower rate of survival, but they can survive. So we know that the population is smaller. And then you ever hear those like 13, 14 pound babies that are born with like teeth in their mouth? Those ones are like wild stories. There are a few that pop up, but not that many, because imagine trying to give birth to a baby of that size. Whether it's a C-section or natural birth, there are a lot of complications that can be associated to that. So the average birth weight is what it is because it allows the survival of both mother and child. So that's stabilizing selection and how environments, nature can also kind of shift populations. So there it is again. If we're looking at mice, our rock pocket mice that we just looked at, how we've got the phenotypes associated to this original bell curve. We see directional selection pushing it towards or favoring the darker colored mice for a darker environment. We might have disruptive selection happening, and this could occur for, the possibility, maybe of like trying to adapt between areas of snowfall and then like, fall and winter versus spring and summer, and then having those different areas to survive with, and then stabilizing selection if the area is completely brown, that would better be suited for that. Okay. So there's some more examples of that for you. And I'm done. With that one. My last two slides are going to kind of tie together what I was talking about before. How we have natural selection, we have artificial selection, and now we also have sexual selection, right? The preference of some specific mates based off of whatever traits or adaptations an organism has. So the blue-footed booby, you could Google search that, make sure you have it all in there. Blue-footed booby, they do some crazy mating dances, and they have these different adaptations, right? They're blue feet, but they have this sweet little waddle that they do, and then they puff their wings out and make some noises. Anyway, the brighter blue their feet are, the more attractive they are to mates. That's an example of how there can be a difference between individuals within a population, and we can see that there are some selective sexual pressures that occur or preferences, so those traits are passed along, right? So we got lion manes, we got the puffiness, that sort of thing. I talked about peacock feathers before. So this is called intrasexual selection or competition within the same sex. And intersexual selection is going to be mate choice. This was the last piece I wanted to talk about. How natural selection is not going to fashion perfect organisms. It's not going to eliminate those original alleles that are within the population or phenotypes like we saw in those graphs for our selective pressures. It's going to edit some of the variations a little bit, but it's not going to remove them all from the gene pool. Again, it's going to be limited by certain constraints, and it also deals with compromises as we have like that evolutionary arms race like I talked about, right? There's a give and take that we have between competition for species and within species. But natural selection often just is going to be related to that environment and left up to chance for when those genes are being passed along. So there we have it.